Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Princeton Review live stream for the AP English Language and Composition exam. My name is Gina Donegan. It's nice to see you all here today. I'm a longtime teacher for the Princeton Review, and I'm here to give you some tips and tricks for everything you need to know to be successful on the AP. This happens to be part 2 of a 3-part series on the English language test. We had a session yesterday, so if you happen to miss that, you can just go to YouTube and do a little search for Princeton Review AP English Language Test, and you should be able to find yesterday's session. You can watch it later. If you're joining me from yesterday, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed yesterday's session. And today we're going to talk about some new information for the AP English exam. But for those of you who might have missed the first one, let me just give you a little bit of an update on the most important things you need to know. We're going to talk about some general information. We're going to talk specifically about multiple choice questions. We're going to actually try some multiple choice questions together. And we're also going to talk about how the Princeton Review can help you with the rest of your AP prep, because as you probably know, these tests are coming up soon. So first, let's get you caught up to speed if you happen to miss yesterday's session. And we'll talk about just briefly the most important things you need to know. First of all, different schools are going to be offering the AP on different dates this year and possibly in different formats. So there are one of 3 dates in which you might be taking the test. You might be taking it on Wednesday, May 12th at 8 a.m. As a matter of fact, I think most people will be taking it on that day. And this test happens to be a paper and pencil test, which means it's the traditional AP exam, the same one you would have taken 2 years ago. Not like last year's test, because you might know that last year's test was a little different due to COVID. But now we're back to the good old-fashioned AP exam, the full test. And so if you're taking it on May 12th, you're taking a paper and pencil exam. But it's also possible that you might be taking the test on Wednesday, May 26th. If that's you, then you could be taking a paper and pencil exam, but you could also be taking a digital version of the exam on a computer. And there's a third date. Some people are taking the AP test on Monday, June 7th. And if that's you, you're most likely taking a digital exam on a computer, but it's even possible that you could be doing a paper and pencil test. So if you have no idea when you're scheduled to take the AP, find out from your English teacher as soon as possible and find out whether the test is going to be paper or digital, because that is going to have some important implications for how you might strategize to take the test. The tests are the same either way. So the actual content and the essays, multiple choice questions, it's all basically the same. But there are some special rules for the digital exam that you need to know about. And if you missed yesterday's session, again, you might want to just go back and review that on YouTube later on, because I go into a lot of detail about some of the important differences between the paper and pencil test and the digital test. But let's dive right into some new material. Today, we're going to put the spotlight on the multiple choice section. As you probably know, about half of your AP score, to be precise, 45% of your AP score, is determined by your performance on the multiple choice questions, which are at the beginning of the exam. And so even though the multiple choice questions account for almost half of your score, you only have about an hour to answer these questions, and that's about a third of the overall test. So that means you're going to have to budget your time wisely. By the way, you don't necessarily need to get through every single question to still get a strong AP score. But obviously you want to try to get through most of the questions and be accurate on those. So we're going to talk about how to approach the different types of questions. There are 2 major types of questions that you're going to see, or types of passages. Specifically, you have 5 passages overall with 45 questions. 2 of the passages are reading style passages. So what I mean by that is you'll have a fairly long text, and it's usually nonfiction, and you'll be asked specific questions about the text. Now, keep in mind, this is not exactly like reading comprehension that you've done on other standardized tests. Here, we're going to see much more of a focus on things like rhetorical strategies or literary devices or thinking about the main idea of the text. It's not going to be only about the facts of what the author wrote about. It's also going to focus on all those rhetorical devices and strategies that you've been learning about in class. So that's 2 of the 5 passages. 3 of the 5 passages are called writing passages. And even though we say writing, we're not talking about the essay here. We call them writing passages because they often have more to do with how the author wrote the text. And you'll be asked questions about how the author might be able to make improvements to the text, the text. For instance, adding a sentence or adding a word or phrase or removing a word or phrase, or maybe just changing something to clarify the meaning. So in a lot of cases, these texts are a little bit easier to read, but they're going to require a different set of skills. So we're going to look at examples of both of these types of passages because obviously they're both important and you can get a feel for what they're like. You've probably seen some of these in class as well, although a lot of AP teachers put more emphasis on essay writing, so it's possible that you haven't done as much with the multiple choice section. But remember, the multiple choice section is still going to account for almost half of your score. The passages that are chosen for the reading style passages are real text. They're not just written for the test. They are excerpted from, actual publications. And the publications could be even as old as the 19th century, or they could be things that are more modern. So there's no way to know exactly what we're going to see. And the passages usually involve some kind of argumentation, like, the author is arguing in favor of or against something, and your job is to figure out what that is. Now, the passages for the writing questions will be noticeably shorter. That's a good thing. And usually written in a more simple style. But they may even feel a little bit flawed because these passages are actually meant to be imperfect because you'll be asked questions about how to change them. And it might even in some cases feel like something that you might write, a sort of casual essay, or, the kind of essay you might write for a class. So our goal is to try to read the passages actively and efficiently to try to identify main points. We don't have to memorize the passages because, as you probably know, this is an open passage test. You have access to the passage as you're answering the questions. So you don't have to memorize it. You just have to get a general sense of what it's about and then refer back to the text as you're answering the questions. Oftentimes, the questions require you to know the passage as a whole or to read large chunks of context. So you can't just sort of read one sentence to answer the question. You typically need a paragraph or maybe even more than that. Overall, we want to concentrate on the author's purpose, tone, and point of view. Because if the author has an opinion about the subject, which they often do, in a lot of cases, many of the questions will test you on that. For instance, if the author strongly disagrees with something, you have to pick up on that as you're reading. Otherwise, you could miss a lot of questions. So once you read the passage, always ask yourself, okay, in a nutshell, what was this about? It's also a good idea to notice rhetorical strategies. Now, you don't necessarily have to take notes on all the rhetorical strategies, but if you happen to see something obvious, like, here's a simile or here's a rhetorical question, you might even want to just underline it if you're taking the paper and pencil test, because you never know, you might be tested on that later. But ultimately, we can always refer back to the text as we're doing the questions, so we don't have to try to spot everything on the first pass. Now, a good guide for the entire multiple choice section is always go back to the passage. Never try to base an answer on memory. That's always a bad idea because your memory of the text may not be quite right. And the good news is, in a lot of cases, they're going to refer you to a specific set of lines or a specific paragraph. And so you'll know exactly where to find the answer. Even if there is no line or paragraph reference, There's usually something obvious in the question that you can skim for that will give you an idea of where the answer lives. Relying on memory might seem faster, but unfortunately, it's just not reliable. You might get half the questions right, but you might get half of them wrong. If you want to get most of them right, you really do have to refer back to the text every time. So if they give you a specific line reference, a good rule of thumb is to read about 5 lines before and 5 lines after the line reference. Now you can round that off to the nearest sentence or paragraph. It doesn't have to be exact. But the key is don't just read the 1 or 2 lines that are mentioned. The context is always important. Let's talk about pacing. Now, again, you have 60 minutes to answer 45 questions. If you think about it, that's not a lot of time, right? And if we factor in the reading of the passages, that's really not a lot of time. So you do have to pace yourself wisely. On the paper and pencil exam, you will have the freedom to skip around throughout the section as you want to. So let's say, for instance, you consider the writing passages to be easier. You can skip ahead and do the writing passages first. That's perfectly fine. And then go back to the reading passages later. Bear in mind, though, that if you're taking a digital exam, you won't be able to do that. On the digital exam, you'll have to work everything in order. So I think if you're taking a digital AP this year, it's going to be really important for you to keep an eye on the clock and know where you are in the section. You don't have to be so uptight about the time that you time yourself on every question. That's not a good strategy. That's nerve-wracking. But what you might want to do is give yourself a goal for each passage. Like, okay, I'd like to finish this passage in 10 or 12 minutes. That would be a good goal, and then you can pace yourself successfully and not have a bunch of leftover questions at the end. Specifically, I'm talking to the people taking the digital exam because, again, you can't skip around as you wish to. So if you're not sure whether you're taking the paper and pencil or the digital exam, find out soon so that you can do a little practice. By the way, this just came out recently. If you are taking the digital AP, there's some free software that you can use to practice for the digital AP. And I think you have to get access to that from your AP English teacher. So just talk to him or her soon and find out if you can get access to that practice software. If you're taking the paper and pencil exam, you don't necessarily need to practice with the software. But for the digital test, I think it's going to be really good to just see what it's like before you sit down and do it. Now, on the paper and pencil exam, since we do have the freedom to skip around, we always want to use what we call the 2-pass system. The 2-pass system means on your first pass through the section, answer the questions that seem easier to you. So like I said, maybe you like the reading passages better, do those first. Maybe you like the writing passages better, do those first. Now, on each one of those passages, you're going to have easier and harder questions. So if you come to any questions that are giving you a real hard time, just skip over them. Circle the question number in your test booklet, and you can go back to it on your second pass. Don't be skipping around so much that you're cherry picking, right? So we don't want to answer question 10 and then go back and answer question 2 and then go to question 20. That's not an efficient way to do it. But the 2-pass system works really well for most people. Again, unfortunately, we can't use this on the digital test, but it's really useful for people taking the paper and pencil test. Now, let's say you run out of time. Again, that's not necessarily a terrible thing. You can still get a good AP score, even if you run out of time and have a few questions unanswered. But the key is we don't actually want to leave those questions blank because as we talked about yesterday, there's no guessing penalty on the AP. You simply earn a point for every right answer. You don't lose any points for wrong answers. So the good news is you should pick a letter guess for everything, right? Even if you run out of time or even if you have no idea what the answer is, just take a guess. And what we suggest is to use the same letter guess for the entire test. We call it letter of the day. And that just means you're going to choose a random letter, A, B, C, D, or E. And if you don't have time to answer a question, just pick that answer. If you use that strategy, you might actually pick up a couple of extra points. Um, and again, this is only for random guessing, right? Some of you may not be doing a lot of random guessing, but if you find yourself in that situation, letter of the day is a good strategy. Okay, so we have a really good question from the chat field. Will it be possible to underline or annotate passages in the digital exam? I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure about that. That's why if you are taking the digital exam, please get access to that digital app or practice demo software that I was telling you about, because then you'll know for sure whether underlining or annotating are possible. Actually, I do know that there's no annotating. However, you will have access to scratch paper. So that's a definite. You will have access to scratch paper. I'm just not sure if there's like a highlighting or an underlining tool on the test. I'm not positive about that. My guess would be that there probably is not, but you never know. We might get into that practice demo software and find out that there is. So it's good to have no surprises, right? So if you know you're taking the digital test, just plan accordingly. Okay, so somebody else asked, what are some tips for reading passages quickly but thoroughly? I want to have the most time to write and answer the questions, but to also make sure I know exactly what the author is talking about. That's a great question. So, first of all, the reading passages are going to take longer to read. That's for sure. The writing passages just tend to be shorter. But for the reading passages, I would say a good guideline is don't spend much more than about 3 or 4 minutes reading the text. Okay, so if you want to practice with pacing, that would be a good guideline. No more than 3 or 4 minutes reading the actual reading passage. And when it comes to writing, I don't think you have to stress about the timing so much because those passages are shorter. You're actually not, there aren't a lot of deep thoughts in those passages, to be honest with you. It gets difficult when you get to the question, but the passages themselves aren't as difficult. So I think what you want to play with is just how long does it take you to read one of the reading passages? And the good news is there are only two of them, right? So if you try to work on that 3 to 4 minute guideline, that's going to free you up to have more time on the questions. And so this is why we should never be trying to time ourselves on individual questions. That doesn't make any sense because you have to invest time in reading the text, and then it's going to take a certain amount of time per question. But what we can do is figure that, somewhere between 10 to 12 minutes for each passage is a good timing. If it's taking you longer than that, let's say it's taking you 15 minutes to do a reading passage and all of the questions. Well, what that means, obviously, is you're going to have to be a bit faster on the writing passages. And that's okay, right? That strategy might work well for you because maybe writing is your strong suit. But if you're taking a paper and pencil test, that would be a reason to do the writing passages first if you think you're faster and you're going to get through those more efficiently. So you kind of just have to play around with it for yourself. But that's why we have lots of practice tests in our Cracking the AP English Language and Composition book, exactly for this reason, so that you can practice timing yourself and get that down to something that works for you. Now, another little tip that we always like to use for sections like this is POE. POE stands for Process of Elimination. Bear in mind that you don't need a lot of outside knowledge for this, right? You need a little bit of outside knowledge. So if they talk about, say, an appeal to authority, or they talk about a metaphor, you obviously have to know what those things are. But for the most part, all of our answers are coming directly from the text. And so you don't have to just automatically know what the right answer is. You really just have to find wrong answers and eliminate them. So if you know that something wasn't stated in the text, just cross it out, right? Cross out 4 answers and the one you have left is the best. That's always the way you want to view this, because sometimes the correct answer is not a great answer. It's just the least wrong out of the 5 that you were given. And so those were some good questions. If anybody has any other questions, feel free to just type those into the chat field. And Shadna will pass the question on to me and I can answer it for you. So we're now going to take a look at some examples of passages and questions just to get a feel for what this is like. Um, this is an example of an introduction that comes at the beginning of a reading passage. And as I mentioned, the reading passages themselves are very long, and you do need to read them, and you also should read the introduction because it's not going to take very long to read the introduction, and it's going to give you a really nice overview of what you're about to read. So let's read through this one together. It says the following passage is excerpted from a technical guide for monitoring wildlife habitat by the United States Department of Agriculture Forest Service. The publication that includes this excerpt is intended as a guide for professionals involved in forest planning and wildlife habitat monitoring. It was published in 2013 by the USDA Forest Service, which aims to balance the use of public resources with the protection of those resources. The authors are professionals in such fields as ecology, biology, and forestry. So the reason it's important to read the introduction is it's going to give you a lot of information in just a short little blurb. Like, what do we know here? We know who the authors are. They are professionals in their field. So that might remind you of appeal to authority or ethos. We also know what they're trying to do. They're trying to guide other people in forest planning and wildlife habitat. So that is their purpose. And we probably get a sense too that the tone of this passage is going to be fairly serious, maybe even a little dry, right? Because it's written by the government and it's maybe going to be kind of sciencey. Now, I'm going to show you what the passages look like, although we're not going to take the time to read them all here in this session. Remember, you should be reading them on the test for sure. But just in the interest of time, I'm not going to bore you with reading the whole thing. But here we have 3 paragraphs labeled management considerations. Then we have a whole other set of 2 paragraphs labeled biological considerations. And then it even spills over into another column. So as you can see, it's pretty long, but it is important to read the whole thing because it's rather difficult to answer these questions without knowing the passage. You might be able to answer some of them, but there are going to be some questions that really do require you to know the text. Another thing you might notice here is we have a lot of footnotes. Why so many footnotes? Well, I don't know. The College Board likes footnotes, and they really like to test you on footnotes. You're probably going to see 1 or 2 footnote questions on each passage. So when you're given the questions, um, the decision for people taking the paper test is, how should I order the questions, right? Should I answer them in order or not? If you're taking the paper test, you don't need to answer the questions in order, and in fact, you might not always want to do that. For example, this first question asks us for the author's main purpose. This is a very general question. It requires you to know the whole passage. Well, if you read and understood the passage perfectly, then great, you could go ahead and do this question first. But what if you felt a little confused? What if you weren't entirely sure about everything you were reading? This would actually be a better question to leave for later. Now, again, digital test takers, the sad news is you can't do this. You're just going to have to answer the questions in order. But that just means that if you don't understand the main purpose, go back and read a little bit of the text again just to make sure that you've got it figured out before you tackle this question. Because on the digital exam, once you select an answer, you have to commit to that answer and you can't go back to it. So we just need to be careful and efficient on the digital exam. Now let's take a look at an example of more specific questions. Like I said, most of them will direct you to a specific line or a paragraph. This question directs us to paragraph 4, and I think you can all see this up on the screen right now. So what I'd like you to do is just take a minute to read this paragraph that I have up on the screen, and then read through all 5 of the answers and see which one you think answers the question. And if you want to, you could share your answer in the chat field. Try it out. So hopefully you've all had a chance to read through that. And again, if you have an answer here you think looks right, feel free to type that into the chat field if you want to. It's okay if you're wrong. Um, but the first thing I want to say about this question is they use the word implies, right? Paragraph 4 implies something. Be really careful when you see words like imply, infer, or suggest. They don't mean what you think they mean. Because usually we think of implying or inferring something as kind of indirect, right? Like, well, it didn't say it, but it sort of meant it, right? However, when the College Board uses that word, they actually don't mean imply. What they really mean is which one of these answers can you prove based on the text? That's what we're looking for. So if we go through our choices here, answer A is the kind of answer that might look tempting if you're taking the word implies too far, right? Because you might think, oh, well, yeah, they don't have unlimited resources. But if you look carefully, the paragraph actually never said that. It never said anything about resources, and it didn't say that they were limited. So if we can't prove it from the text, it's not a right answer. How about answer B? Forest management programs focus only on the physical environment. I want you to be really suspicious of answers that use words like always, only, any, all. Those very extreme answers tend to be wrong. It seems like they're focusing on the physical environment, but I don't know. It's a little too extreme to say that that's only what they're focusing on. There could be things other than the physical environment. I don't know what those are, but it's possible, right? How about C? The impact of forest management programs cannot be predicted. Well, again, if you hunt through this paragraph for the word predicted, you're just not going to find it. So that one we can't prove. How about D? Forest management programs include climate change. Again, climate change is just not something that's mentioned. So if it's not in there, don't pick that answer. Our best answer is answer E. How can we prove that? Well, basically with the last sentence, right? The last sentence says selecting emphasis species should include not only those that are associated with forest plan objectives or desired conditions, but also those that have the potential to be affected by management actions that modify habitat. So that's what E is basically saying. You shouldn't just confine your habitat monitoring to species that are part of the programs. You should include apparently other species. So whether they say implies, suggests, infers, states, no matter how the question is worded, it really doesn't matter. What they're always asking you for is what information can you prove from the text? If you can't find it in there, it's a trap answer. Let's take a look at another one. And once again, they're directing us to a specific paragraph, the last sentence of paragraph 2. So even though they're only asking about the last sentence, we do need to read the context, right? So go ahead and read this entire paragraph up on the screen. When you get to that last sentence, just see if you can put that last sentence in your own words and then look at the answers to see which one might match. And again, if you have an answer you think is right, just let me know by typing into the chat. Okay, so let's really focus on the last sentence of that paragraph. It says, memoranda of understanding with state wildlife agencies. Now, that's a little bit of a confusing phrase, but look at what it says after that. Obligate the Forest Service to assist with monitoring populations of species. So, what that's saying is the Forest Service is the one that's obligated. Answer A, readers must consult the Forest Service. We don't see that in this sentence, so let's cross out A. How about B? The Forest Service requires state wildlife agencies to include it in monitoring game species populations. That's not really what that sentence says, right? Because it's the Forest Service that is actually the one that's obligated. The memoranda of understanding, whatever that is, obligate the Forest Service. Answer B makes it sound like the Forest Service is bossing around the state wildlife agencies, right? So that's the opposite. How about C? The Forest Service must be involved in population monitoring programs. Okay, obligate, must be involved. That seems close. D, permission must be obtained from the Forest Service before game populations are monitored. No, because again, that makes it sound like the Forest Service is the one in charge. Not necessarily. They're the ones obligated, but we don't know if they're the ones calling all the shots. And how about E? The Forest Service demands control of game species. Well, that sounds really extreme, doesn't it? Like the Forest Service is the big boss telling everyone what to do. Demands control is not the same as being obligated to do something. So the best choice is C. They are obligated, therefore they must be involved. Notice how the best answer isn't worded exactly the same way as the passage. It's slightly different, but it's still fairly close. So the best answer will be a nice paraphrase of what the passage said. Now, here's an example of a question that is more general, and it specifically asks about rhetorical strategies. Now, we haven't read the whole passage, so we don't necessarily know all the rhetorical strategies that the authors used. But notice how it does require you to know perhaps um, something more general about those rhetorical strategies. So that's why I advised you to take notes on those as you're reading, because you often have a question exactly like this one. You can also watch out for answers that kind of violate your common sense. So, for example, the question says the authors are trying to convince readers that they are. Now, let's look at answer E, set in their ways. That sounds kind of negative, doesn't it? I mean, I don't think that the College Board is going to say that the Forest Service is set in their ways. So that one is almost certain to be wrong, but any of the other ones are possible answers. So we would want to look at the passage generally to see if we can find any proof for this. This is the kind of question that you might want to leave for last if you're not sure about it because it's more general. Paper and pencil people can leave it for last. Here's another general question that asks about rhetorical strategy. And this one might require you to know specific things like appeal to authority, understatement. These are all terms that you would have learned in your AP class at some point. So, along with learning rhetorical strategies for the essays, you also want to keep them in mind for multiple choice. Here's an example of a question that will test you on a word. We call these vocabulary and context questions. Now, keep in mind that even if it's a word you've never heard of before, like taxa, you should always be able to figure it out in context. So what you want to do is read the full context, and there should be clues in the sentence that will tell you what a taxa is. Here's an example of a footnote question. So in this case, they're asking about the primary function of footnote 9. And all we see in footnote 9 is this little note, see chapter 1, which is a little strange, right? So you can't just read the footnote. You also have to read the sentence or maybe even several sentences that came before the footnote. And that's going to give you an idea of why the footnote is there. These questions are not usually that difficult, but again, you do need to read the text. You can't just read the footnote. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to show you an example of a writing passage. I mentioned earlier that the writing passages are usually shorter. This is it, 4 paragraphs. It's a lot shorter than the reading. And the style of the writing tends to be a little bit easier to read, which is a great thing for us. The only caution is these passages are designed to be a little imperfect. Notice it says the passage below is a draft. So what that means is as you're reading it, you might notice things like awkward wordings or ideas that might even feel like they're missing or ideas that are in the wrong place. There might feel like there's something a little off with some of the paragraphs. That's okay. When you read this passage, all you're trying to do is get a general idea of what it's about. That's it. You don't have to find all the mistakes in it. You don't have to, analyze it too much. As a matter of fact, you really don't need to read it as carefully as you do the reading passages. Um, really, all you're trying to do is just get a sense of what this thing is about. And again, we're not going to take the time to read it, but it's obviously talking a lot about plastic water bottles, right? So then when you do the questions, you can do the questions in order without too much of a problem. But again, if you're taking the paper and pencil exam, you don't have to do the questions in order. If you want to skip one and come back to it, that's perfectly fine. A lot of the questions are going to direct you to a specific place in the text. So for example, question number 1 says, which one of the following sentences, if placed before sentence 1, would both engage the audience's attention and introduce the topic of the paragraph? Well, I always say writing questions are all about the question. What I mean by that is you have to pay close attention to exactly what they're asking for. Because all of these answers might sound good, okay? But we can't base it just on how it sounds. We have to make sure we're answering the question as directly as possible. So let's take a look at this two-sentence paragraph. Bottled water comprises 67.3% of plastic bottle use in the United States, a leading cause of waste that threatens our oceans and our air quality. Many cities, venues, colleges, and recreational areas have decided to ban single-use plastic water bottles. Okay, so we know it's about plastic water bottles, but we also have to remember this part about engaging the audience's attention. So it has to do both. It has to engage our attention and it has to introduce the topic. So the first thing I would look for is answers that really are not related to the topic. So for example, how about answer E? Residents of Flint, Michigan were exposed to unsafe tap water when private companies bottled their water supply. Well, okay, it uses the word bottle, but this passage is not about safety at all, right? So answer E is not introducing the topic very well. So we can cross that one out. How about answer D? Cities that have already banned single-use plastic bottles are planning to increase the number of public drinking fountains. Well, it's related to the topic, but the problem is they didn't talk about banning plastic use water bottles until sentence 2. So it really wouldn't make sense to talk about this before sentence 1. It's out of place. So we can definitely cross off answer D. How about answer C? Bottled water manufacturers have been known to deplete water supplies. Well, again, that's not really what this passage or what this paragraph is about. It's really about plastic being a cause of waste, right? So depleting water supplies, that's not really the point. So we're down to 2 answers. Let's just kind of compare them and see what makes them different. Answer A. In 2017, Americans consumed nearly 17 billion gallons of bottled water. Does that get your attention? Well, it seems like a lot of water, right? So it does kind of get my attention. And it is sort of related to the topic, so let's keep that. How about B? Every second, 20,000 plastic water bottles are bought around the world, most of which contain only drinking water. Well, that kind of gets my attention too, and it does seem related to the topic. So this is really common. Sometimes we'll have two answers that seem good. What do you do in that situation? Well, what you almost always have to do is think about the exact meaning and how it fits into the sequence of the paragraph. Because sentence one is already telling you that bottled water comprises 67.3% of plastic bottle use. So when you think about it, answer B is kind of just saying the same thing, right? 20,000 plastic bottles, most of which contain only drinking water. That's really just a different way of saying what sentence one already says. So even though answer B is close, answer A is a little better because it's not just a rehash of what was already in sentence one. Sentence A is giving you the big picture, right? Which is, wow, we consume a lot of water. And then get this, sentence one, bottled water comprises 67.3 of plastic bottle use. So that means this 17 billion gallons is actually just a portion of overall plastic bottle use. So it gives you much more context for how big the problem is, right? We've got all this plastic and 17 billion of it is bottled water. So that gives you a little feel for what the writing questions are like. There are lots of questions exactly like this one. Let's take a look at another one. Sometimes what they'll do is give you a sentence with an underlined portion, and they'll ask you about possibly changing the underlined portion of the sentence. Now, the most important thing to remember here is you can't just read the sentence they gave you. You're going to need the context also. And it's going to be really important to read the question because writing questions are all about the question. So this one says, in sentence two, the author wants a more fluid transition between the introductory sentences and the thesis of the passage. Now, first of all, if the author wants a more fluid transition, then it can't be answer A, right? As it is now wouldn't make any sense because the author wants a more fluid transition. So read the question carefully. We can cross out answer A. Now let's look at our other choices because it not only needs to be a more fluid transition, but it needs to be related to the thesis. So this is where we're going to need our context. So let's go back to sentence one again. Sentence one was the one that talked about how bottled water comprises a certain percentage of plastic bottle use, a leading cause of waste that threatens our oceans and our air quality. So we can see that this author obviously has an opinion, right? These plastic bottles are a problem. So we're looking for something at the beginning of the sentence that would transition from that idea of a problem or a threat. Answer C, it has nothing to do with this paragraph, right? There are no corporate interests mentioned in the paragraph, and we don't know if this would anger them anyway. So C, we can eliminate. What about D? To protect developing communities abroad. Well, again, there's nothing in this paragraph about people in foreign countries. So that's not related to the thesis, and it doesn't give us a very good transition. So we're down to two possibilities. Answer B says, in order to reduce waste and protect the environment, so that might relate to the waste that threatens our oceans and air quality. Or answer E, seeing it as an ethical imperative. Well, again, it comes down to the main idea. Yes, they may see it as an ethical imperative, but answer B is giving you more of what was mentioned in sentence one, right? It's mentioning the waste and it's mentioning the environment. That's exactly what they talked about in sentence one. So transitions are really about looking at the ends of sentences and matching them up with the beginnings of sentences, right? The end of sentence one was about something specific. We want that to match up with the beginning of sentence two. Answer B does that in the best way possible. So as you can see, these questions are not about pick the one that sounds the best. They're really not about grammar, right? All of these answers are grammatically correct. They're primarily about sticking to the meaning of the text and, most importantly, reading the question. Let's take a look at one more, and then I think we'll be done. Uh, the writer wants to emphasize the surprising increase in plastic bottle use between 2006 and 2017, described in sentences 4 and 5. Adjusting for capitalization is needed. Which phrase best accomplishes this goal at the start of sentence 5? Now, notice I have not given you the paragraph for this one. And the reason I haven't given you the paragraph is because writing questions are all about the question. And this says the writer wants to emphasize the surprising increase. Well, just take a look at all of your answers. Which one has to do with a surprise? Hopefully, you said answer D. Shockingly, right? It's the only one that has to do with a surprise. Some of these others could sound good, but D is the only one that actually answers the question. So you can see a theme here, right? Stick to the context, read the context, but most importantly, answer the question that they're asking you. So before we wrap up for today, I just want to give you an idea of how you can move forward with your own AP preparation. The first thing you can do is join me for the live stream tomorrow. Tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern, we're going to have another live stream, and we're really going to focus on essays tomorrow. So if you're concerned about those essays, we're going to talk about all the different types of essays and how to approach them. Another thing you can do is go to princetonreview.com and find out about AP tutoring. AP tutoring is done with people like me who will meet at your schedule, give you specific feedback. You'll have flexibility as to what you want to cover. So if you only want to focus on the synthesis essay, you can do that. So tutoring is a good option. We also offer things called cram courses. The cram courses are going to be held right before your test, and they're going to give you 6 hours with a teacher like me in a live setting where you'll learn a little bit of everything you need to know for the test. You'll also get access to our Cracking the AP English Language and Composition book. Um, that comes with the course. You can also access the book from any major book retailer. And the books look like this. They come in a variety of subjects. So if you're taking multiple APs this year, these are great books because they only teach you the things you need to know and leave out a lot of the things you don't need to know. So we're just about done for today, but thank you so much for joining me. And hopefully I'll see you tomorrow for part 3. Have a good evening, everyone.